The night Yates Zimmerman found the woman curled in the third pew from the altar, her dark hair spilling over the worn wood like ink on parchment. He knew his carefully ordered life was about to unravel in ways he could not yet imagine. Old Tucson blazed under an unforgiving Arizona sun most days, but the desert nights brought bone-deep cold that crept through every crack in the small adobe church. Yates had stopped by to retrieve the saddle blanket he'd left after helping Father Miguel repair the roof that afternoon. It was October 1883, and the territory still felt raw and unsettled despite the railroad's arrival 5 years prior. He'd been working his family's cattle ranch since his father died 2 years back, pouring every waking hour into keeping the operation solvent. At 26, he'd resigned himself to a life measured in livestock prices and water rights disputes. The woman stirred as his boots echoed on the stone floor, but she didn't wake. Yates stood there, blanket forgotten, studying her pale face in the moonlight streaming through the high windows. She wore a traveling dress that had once been fine but now showed the dust and wear of hard miles. Her hands were tucked under her cheek like a child's, but the shadows beneath her eyes spoke of exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. He didn't disturb her. Something about the vulnerability of her sleeping form made him back away quietly, collecting his blanket and slipping out into the cool desert night. But as he rode home beneath stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, he couldn't shake the image of her from his mind. The second night, he came prepared. Father Miguel had mentioned nothing about a vagrant in his church, which meant either the woman was hiding her presence or the old priest's failing eyesight had missed her entirely. Yates brought a thick wool blanket this time, along with a wrapped portion of the beef and cornbread his housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, had packed for his supper. He left them on the pew beside the sleeping woman, close enough that she'd find them upon waking but not so close as to startle her. She slept in the same pew, third from the altar on the left side. Her dark hair was braided now, a practical plait that hung over her shoulder. In sleep, her face had relaxed from whatever worry plagued her waking hours. Yates judged her to be perhaps 23 or 24, young but not girlish. There was a strength in the set of her jaw, a determination that even unconsciousness couldn't fully erase. This time he noticed details he'd missed before. A small carpet bag tucked beneath the pew, its leather worn smooth with age. The way she'd positioned herself to be invisible from the main entrance, choosing the shadows over the moonlit center aisle. She wasn't just tired, she was hiding. The third night, Yates arrived earlier, just as the sun painted the desert rocks in shades of amber and rust. He told himself he was being neighborly, that any decent person would check on someone clearly in distress. But the truth hummed beneath his skin like electricity before a summer storm. He wanted to see her awake. He wanted to know her name, her story, the reason those shadows lived beneath her eyes. He found her sitting upright in the pew, the blanket he'd left the previous night wrapped around her shoulders. The food was gone. She turned at the sound of his entrance, and Yates felt the full force of her gaze strike him like a physical blow. Her eyes were the color of honey held up to lamplight, luminous and wary in equal measure. "I should thank you," she said, her voice rougher than he'd expected, as though she hadn't used it in days. "For the blanket and the food, that was kind. You planning to sleep here indefinitely?" Yates heard the edge in his own voice and regretted it immediately. He wasn't angry. He was worried, and worry made him sharp. She stood, and he realized she was taller than he'd thought, probably 5'7" to his 6'1". "I'll move on tomorrow. I didn't mean to impose. That's not what I meant." He moved closer, keeping his movements slow and unthreatening. Working with horses had taught him how to read fear, and this woman wore it like a second skin. I'm Yates Zimmerman. My family owns a cattle ranch about 3 miles northeast of town. You look like you could use more than a church pew and a wool blanket. I'm fine. But her voice wavered on the last word, betraying her. You've been sleeping in a church for 3 nights running. That's not fine by any definition I know. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. I've got a guest room. My housekeeper keeps the place respectable. You could have a real bed, hot meals, time to figure out whatever you're running from. Her chin lifted defensively. What makes you think I'm running? Because people who aren't running don't sleep in churches. They rent hotel rooms. He softened his tone. I'm not asking for your life story. I'm offering basic hospitality. She studied him for a long moment, those honey-colored eyes searching his face for deception or ulterior motive. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because her shoulders sagged slightly beneath the borrowed blanket. Just for a few days. Until I can figure out my next move. Fair enough. He extended his hand. Yates Zimmerman. She hesitated before taking it, her palm small and calloused against his. Jane Riley. The ride to the ranch passed in near silence. Jane sat behind him on his horse, a big bay gelding named Copper, her hands resting lightly on his waist. Yates was hyper-aware of her presence, the way she swayed with the horse's rhythm, the faint scent of lavender soap clinging to her despite days of rough living. The desert spread around them in an endless expanse of sagebrush and cacti, the mountains rising like ancient sentinels in the distance. The Zimmerman ranch house was modest but well-maintained, a sprawling adobe structure with a wide front porch and corrals stretching out behind. Mrs. Chen, a Chinese immigrant who'd come west with the railroad workers and stayed when her husband died in a construction accident, met them at the door with her usual unflappable efficiency. If she was surprised to see Yates bringing home a strange woman, she showed no sign of it. Miss Riley will be staying in the guest room, Yates announced. She'll need hot water for washing and a good meal. Mrs. Chen nodded once, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Jane's appearance. I will prepare everything. Come, miss. Jane threw Yates one last uncertain glance before following the housekeeper inside. He stood on the porch, watching dust devils dance across the distant range, and wondered what exactly he'd gotten himself into. Over the next week, Jane slowly came back to life. The first 2 days, she mostly slept, emerging only for meals that she ate with quiet efficiency before disappearing back into the guest room. Yates gave her space, throwing himself into ranch work with his usual intensity. But he found himself timing his return to the house to coincide with supper, found himself listening for her footsteps in the hallway. The third day, he discovered her in the kitchen helping Mrs. Chen prepare bread. Flour dusted her hands, and a strand of dark hair had escaped her braid to curl against her cheek. She looked younger in the warm lamplight, the shadows beneath her eyes finally beginning to fade. You don't have to work for your keep, he said from the doorway. Jane looked up, surprise flickering across her face. I need to keep busy, and Mrs. Chen has been teaching me to make proper bread. Mine always comes out dense as adobe bricks. Mrs. Chen made a sound that might have been a laugh. You are learning. The dough needs patience. Patience isn't my strong suit. Jane's mouth quirked in what wasn't quite a smile but came close. That evening, after Mrs. Chen had retired to her small cottage behind the main house, Yates and Jane sat on the front porch. The October air carried the first real hint of the coming winter, cool enough to make Jane pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Stars blazed overhead in their familiar patterns, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang its lonely song. I came from Missouri, Jane said suddenly, her voice soft in the darkness. I was engaged to be married, Everyone said Martin was such a good match. Successful merchant, respected family. I was supposed to be grateful. Yates waited, knowing there was more. He had a temper. I saw glimpses of it during our courtship, but I told myself it was passion, that he simply felt things deeply. She laughed, a brittle sound that held no humor. 3 weeks before the wedding, I made the mistake of disagreeing with him about something trivial. The silverware pattern for our future home, I think. He grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises, told me I'd learn my place soon enough. Anger, hot and sudden, flooded through Yates. You left. I took what money I'd saved working at my father's store, packed one bag, and bought a train ticket west. I picked Arizona because it was as far as my money would take me. She turned to look at him, moonlight catching in her eyes. Martin comes from a prominent family. He won't take the embarrassment of a broken engagement lightly. I imagine he's looking for me. You think he'd come all the way to Arizona? I think Martin views me as property he's already purchased. Her voice hardened. Yes, I think he'd come this far. Yates leaned back in his chair, his mind already working through the implications. Then you'll stay here. We'll tell people you're a distant cousin who's come to help Mrs. Chen with the housekeeping. Small ranch like this, it's plausible I'd need the extra help. I can't ask you to lie for me. You're not asking, I'm offering. He met her gaze steadily. No one deserves to live in fear, Jane, especially not fear of someone who's supposed to love them. Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the careful walls she'd built around herself. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. Maybe I'd like to. The words came out more honest than he'd intended, hanging in the air between them like a confession. Jane looked away first, but not before he saw the faint blush color her cheeks. I should turn in. Mrs. Chen wants to teach me how to make tamales tomorrow. She stood and moved toward the door, but paused with her hand on the frame. Thank you, Yates, for everything. After she'd gone inside, Yates sat on the porch for another hour, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. He'd spent 2 years focused solely on keeping the ranch afloat, on honoring his father's legacy through backbreaking work and careful management. He'd dated a few women in town, attended the occasional social dance, but nothing had ever caught fire inside him the way those few hours on the porch with Jane had. It terrified him. It exhilarated him. It made him feel alive in a way he'd almost forgotten was possible. The days developed a rhythm. Yates rose before dawn to work with the ranch hands, managing the cattle, mending fences, handling the 1,000 small crises that defined ranch life. Jane took over much of the cooking and housekeeping, working alongside Mrs. Chen with a determination that spoke of her need to contribute. In the evenings, after the work was done and Mrs. Chen had retired, Yates and Jane found themselves drawn to the front porch like moths to flame. They talked about everything and nothing. She told him about growing up in Missouri, the daughter of a German immigrant father and a mother who died when Jane was 12. How she'd essentially raised her 3 younger brothers while helping run her father's general store. How she dreamed of seeing the wider world, but never imagined it would happen under such circumstances. He told her about the ranch, about his father's vision and his own determination to see it through. About the challenges of managing a cattle operation in territory where water rights could start wars and Mexican bandits, sometimes raided across the border. About his mother, who died bringing his stillborn sister into the world when Yates was 15, and how his father had never quite recovered from the loss. Is it lonely? Jane asked one evening about 2 weeks into her stay. Running this place by yourself? Yates considered the question. It was. I didn't realize how much until recently. Their eyes met and held. Something electric passed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings neither was quite ready to name. Jane looked away first, but her hand, resting on the arm of her chair, moved incrementally closer to his. The next day, Yates rode into Old Tucson for supplies. The town was small, a collection of adobe buildings clustered around a dusty main street, but it served as a hub for the surrounding ranches and farms. He was loading flour and coffee into his wagon when Tom Carter, who owned the neighboring ranch, approached. "Heard you got yourself some help out at your place," Tom said, his tone carefully neutral. News traveled fast in small communities. Yates kept his expression bland. "My cousin from Missouri. She's helping Mrs. Chen with the housekeeping." "Cousin, huh?" Tom's weathered face creased in something that might have been skepticism or amusement. "Well, she's mighty pretty for a cousin from what I hear." "She's family, Tom. Don't make it more than it is." But Tom's words followed him home, burrowing under his skin. Because it already was more than a simple family arrangement, and they both knew it. Jane had been at the ranch for almost 3 weeks now, and Yates found himself making excuses to return to the house during the day. Found himself watching her face in lamplight, memorizing the curve of her jaw, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking. Found himself lying awake at night, knowing she slept just down the hallway, close enough to reach in seconds but worlds away. Halloween came and went. Jane helped Mrs. Chen prepare special treats for the ranch hands, somehow managing to coax laughter from the normally stoic older woman. Watching them work together, Yates felt a fierce surge of protectiveness. This was becoming a home again in ways it hadn't been since his mother died. Jane was bringing warmth back to rooms that had grown cold with loneliness. Early November brought news that made his blood run cold. Sheriff Dan Morrison stopped by the ranch with information about a man who'd been asking questions in town. Well-dressed, Eastern accent, looking for a young woman who might have traveled west from Missouri. Dark hair, honey-colored eyes, goes by the name Jane Riley. Claimed to be her fiancé, Sheriff Morrison said, his weathered face grave. Said she ran off in a moment of wedding jitters, that her family's worried sick. But something about him didn't sit right with me. Eyes were too hard for a man supposedly looking for his lost love. "What did you tell him?" Yates kept his voice level through sheer force of will. "Told him I hadn't seen anyone matching that description. Suggested he try Tucson proper since we're just a small settlement." The sheriff paused meaningfully. "But he didn't believe me. He's staying at the hotel watching people, asking questions." After the sheriff left, Yates found Jane in the kitchen. She took one look at his face and set down the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables. "He's here, isn't he? In town. The sheriff's on our side, but Martin knows you're in the area. It's only a matter of time before he comes looking out here." Jane's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "I'll leave tonight. I won't bring trouble to your door." "The hell you will." The vehemence in his voice surprised them both. "You're not running anymore, Jane." "Not if you don't want to." "What choice do I have?" "He'll make a scene. He'll lie and tell everyone I'm his runaway bride, that I'm mentally unstable or some other nonsense to explain why I left. People will believe him because he's respectable and I'm just a woman alone." Yates crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides, taking her hands in his. They were trembling, he realized. This strong, capable woman was shaking with fear, and something inside him cracked wide open. "Then don't be alone. Marry me." Jane's eyes went wide. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated, the words coming faster now as the plan took shape in his mind. "A married woman can't be claimed by another man. If you're my wife, Martin has no legal standing. He'd have to go home empty-handed." "That's insane. You can't marry me just to protect me from Martin." "Can I?" He squeezed her hands gently. "Jane, these past 3 weeks have been the best I've had in years. You make this house feel like a home. You make me laugh. You challenge me. I look forward to seeing your face at the end of every day." He took a shaky breath. "Maybe it's fast. Maybe it's crazy. But I'm not proposing just to save you from Martin. I'm proposing because I've been halfway in love with you since I found you sleeping in that church pew." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "You barely know me. Then we'll spend the rest of our lives getting to know each other better. Say yes, Jane." "Yes." The word came out as half laugh, half sob. "Yes, you ridiculous, wonderful man. Yes." He kissed her then, soft and careful, a promise sealed with the touch of lips. She tasted like hope and home, and everything he hadn't known he was looking for. They were married the next morning in Father Miguel's small church, the same building where Yates had first found Jane sleeping. Mrs. Chen served as witness, her normally stoic face creased in what might have been approval. Sheriff Morrison stood in the back, his presence both blessing and protection. The ceremony was simple, the words spoken quickly but with heartfelt sincerity. When Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, Yates felt the rightness of it settle into his bones. This was no marriage of convenience. This was the beginning of something real, something lasting. They were back at the ranch, sharing a celebratory lunch that Mrs. Chen had prepared when horses approached at speed. Yates moved to the window, his hand instinctively dropping to the pistol at his hip. 4 riders, led by a man in an expensive suit, astride a rented horse he clearly didn't know how to handle properly. "That's him," Jane whispered from beside him. "That's Martin." Yates studied the man who'd driven Jane across half a continent in fear. Martin Whitmore was handsome in a polished way, his features regular and his bearing confident. But there was something cold in his eyes, a calculation that made Yates's skin crawl. "Stay inside," he told Jane, then stepped out onto the porch before she could argue. Martin dismounted with the ranch hands he'd hired as backup, 3 rough-looking men who eyed the property with professional assessment. "I'm looking for Jane Riley," Martin announced, his cultured voice carrying across the yard. "I have reason to believe she's here." "You'd be looking for my wife then, Mrs. Jane Zimmerman." Yates let the words land like stones in still water. Martin's face darkened. "That's impossible. Jane is engaged to me. Whatever lies she's told you, whatever game she's playing, I have legal documents proving our engagement. And I have a legal marriage certificate, signed by Father Miguel and filed with the county this morning. Engagement isn't marriage, Mr. Whitmore. Your claim ended the moment Jane said I do to someone else. You can't do this." Martin's composure was cracking, revealing the rage beneath. "She's mine. I've invested time and money in preparing for our wedding. Her father approved the match. Her father isn't here, and even if he was, a woman's not property to be transferred between men." Yates kept his voice level, but his hand stayed near his pistol. "Jane made her choice. She chose to leave you. She chose to marry me. You need to respect that and ride back to wherever you came from." "I'll contest the marriage. I'll have it annulled." "On what grounds? She's of age. She married of her own free will. You've got no legal standing here, Whitmore." The door opened behind Yates, and Jane stepped out onto the porch. She changed into the new dress Mrs. Chen had helped her make for the wedding, a simple but pretty blue calico that matched her eyes. "Go home, Martin. You ungrateful little fool. Do you have any idea what I've sacrificed for you? The embarrassment you've caused my family?" Martin started forward, and the 3 hired men moved with him. Yates's pistol cleared leather before Martin took 2 steps. "That's far enough." Sheriff Morrison chose that moment to ride into the yard, his timing suspiciously convenient. "Problem here, folks." "No problem, Sheriff," Yates said, not taking his eyes off Martin. "Mr. Whitmore was just leaving." Martin's face had gone red with fury, but he was smart enough to recognize a losing situation. The sheriff's presence, Yates's drawn weapon, and the ranch hands who'd emerged from the bunkhouse at the sound of conflict all pointed to one conclusion. "This isn't over," he hissed. "Yes, it is," Jane said quietly. "It was over the moment you showed me who you really are. I would rather spend one day as Yates's wife than a lifetime as your property. Go home, Martin. Find someone who doesn't know better, but you'll never have me." For a moment, Yates thought Martin might do something truly stupid, but whatever else he was, the man wasn't completely foolish. He remounted his horse with stiff, angry movements, gesturing for his hired men to follow. "You deserve each other," he spat, before wheeling his horse around and spurring it toward town. The tension didn't leave the yard until the riders had disappeared in a cloud of dust. Jane sagged against Yates, and he holstered his pistol to wrap his arms around her. She was shaking again, but this time he recognized it as release rather than fear. "It's really over," she murmured against his chest. "It's really over," he confirmed. "You're safe now, you're home." That night, their wedding night, they lay together in the bed that had been Yates's alone for so many years. The awkwardness he'd anticipated never materialized. Instead, there was tenderness, wonder, a slow exploration that felt like the most natural thing in the world. Jane fit against him perfectly, her head tucked beneath his chin, her breathing gradually slowing into the rhythm of sleep. Yates stayed awake longer, thinking about the strange path that had led them here. If he hadn't gone to the church that night, if she'd chosen a different town, if either of them had been slightly less brave or slightly more cautious. But somehow, against all odds, they'd found each other. Winter settled over Arizona with surprising intensity. Cold winds swept down from the mountains, and occasional snow dusted the high desert. Jane threw herself into learning everything about ranch life, riding out with Yates to check on the cattle, helping with the endless work that kept the operation running. She learned to read the weather, to predict when storms were coming, to tell which cows were about to calve. Mrs. Chen taught her to cook meals that would stick to a working man's ribs, to preserve food for the lean months, to manage a household with efficiency and grace. Jane absorbed it all with the same determination she'd shown in everything. But it was in the evenings when she and Yates were alone that she truly came alive. They talked for hours, learning each other's thoughts and dreams and fears. They made love with increasing confidence and joy, discovering pleasure in each other's bodies and comfort in each other's arms. Yates found himself thinking in terms of we instead of I, making plans that included Jane as naturally as breathing. Christmas came, and Jane decorated the house with pine boughs and handmade ornaments, transforming the sparse ranch house into something warm and festive. They attended midnight mass in the church where they'd married, and Yates felt Jane's hand squeeze his as Father Miguel spoke about miracles and new beginnings. In January, as the new year of 1884 began, Jane started feeling ill in the mornings. Mrs. Chen noticed before Yates did, her experienced eyes reading the signs with ease. When she finally told him, in the privacy of their bedroom one evening, Yates felt joy surge through him so intensely it was almost painful. A baby. He placed his hand on her still flat stomach with wondering reverence. "Are you sure? Mrs. Chen says all the signs are there. I think she knew before I did." Jane covered his hand with hers, lacing their fingers together. "I'm scared and excited and happy all at once. We're going to be parents." The reality of it settled over him like a blanket. "I'm going to be a father." "A wonderful father," Jane said firmly, "just like you've been a wonderful husband." Their son was born in September as the brutal Arizona summer finally began to break. The labor was long and difficult, and Yates spent most of it pacing the living room while Mrs. Chen and the midwife attended Jane. When the baby's cry finally rang out, strong and healthy, Yates burst into the bedroom to find Jane exhausted but smiling, a tiny bundle cradled against her chest. "His name is Thomas," she said, "after your father." Yates had to blink back tears as he looked down at his son, this perfect tiny human they'd created together. Thomas had a shock of dark hair, and when his eyes briefly opened, they were the color of honey in lamplight. Jane's eyes. "He's perfect," Yates managed. "You're perfect. I love you so much. I love you too." Jane reached up to cup his cheek with her free hand. "Thank you for finding me in that church. Thank you for giving me a real bed, a real home, a real life." "Thank you for letting me," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead and then one to Thomas's soft baby head. "Thank you for choosing to stay." The years that followed were marked by hard work, deep love, and the particular chaos that comes with children. Caroline was born 2 years after Thomas, with her father's dark blonde hair and stubborn determination. Then came Jacob, arriving after 3 years with his mother's quick mind and his father's steady temperament. The ranch prospered under Yates's management and Jane's fierce efficiency. They added land, improved their herd, built a proper bunkhouse for the growing crew of ranch hands. Mrs. Chen remained with them until her peaceful death in 1891, leaving a hole in their hearts, but also countless memories of her quiet wisdom and unexpected kindness. Jane never heard from Martin Whitmore again, though they learned through distant channels that he'd eventually married a banker's daughter in St. Louis. She felt nothing about the news except relief that some other woman had proven more suited to him than she'd been. The children grew tall and strong, raised with love and clear expectations. Thomas showed an early aptitude for working with horses. Caroline revealed an unexpected gift for numbers, helping her father manage the ranch accounts by the time she was 12. Jacob, the youngest, had inherited his mother's determination and his father's calm presence, becoming the mediator between his more volatile siblings. On cool desert evenings, Yates and Jane still found time to sit together on the porch, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Their hands were more weathered now, marked by years of labor and life, but they still fit together perfectly when clasped. "Do you ever regret it?" Yates asked one evening when they were both in their 40s, watching their children play in the yard. "The life you might have had if you'd stayed in Missouri, if you'd chosen differently." Jane turned to look at him, and in her eyes he saw everything they'd built together. The children, the ranch, the life they'd carved out of harsh desert and harder work. "Not for a single second," she said. "You gave me more than a real bed that week I was sleeping in the church. You gave me the courage to choose my own life. You gave me a home. You gave me love. Everything good I have started the night you found me." "Everything good I have started that same night," Yates replied, pulling her close. "I went looking for a saddle blanket and found my whole future." As the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars began to emerge, their children's laughter rang across the yard. Caroline was chasing Thomas while Jacob attempted to mediate their latest disagreement, a scene that had played out countless times before and would play out countless times again. Inside the house, supper waited on the table, prepared by Jane's capable hands. In the corrals, horses nickered softly as the ranch hands finished their day's work. It was an ordinary evening on an Arizona ranch in 1897, unremarkable in every way except one. It was built on a foundation of love, trust, and the courage to choose hope over fear. And that, Yates thought as Jane's head settled onto his shoulder, made it the most extraordinary thing in the world. Years continued their steady march. Thomas married a schoolteacher from Tucson and took over day-to-day management of the ranch, proving to have inherited his father's steady leadership, and his mother's business acumen. Caroline, defying convention, attended university in California and returned with a degree in mathematics, eventually establishing herself as a respected bookkeeper for several large ranches in the territory. Jacob, after trying various paths, found his calling as a veterinarian, studying in Denver before returning to serve the ranching community he'd grown up in. Yates and Jane watched their children build their own lives with pride and occasional heartache, as parents do. They became grandparents in 1905, when Thomas and his wife welcomed twin girls into the world, followed by a steady stream of other grandchildren from all three of their children. The ranch house expanded to accommodate family gatherings, echoing with childish laughter on holidays and weekends. Through it all, through the joys and sorrows and ordinary days that make up a life, Yates and Jane remained each other's constant. They weathered droughts that threatened the ranch's survival, navigating those lean years with the same determination that had brought them together. They celebrated Arizona's statehood in 1912, marveling at how much the territory had changed since that night in 1883, when a desperate woman had fallen asleep in a church pew. They grew old together, their bodies wearing the marks of hard labor and full lives. Yates's hair went white, though his eyes remained as sharp as ever. Jane's hands developed arthritis that made certain tasks difficult, but she worked around it with characteristic stubbornness. They moved a bit slower, retired earlier in the evenings, but the essential core of who they were together remained unchanged. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1914, their children threw them a celebration that brought together what seemed like half of Old Tucson. Friends and neighbors, business associates, and ranch hands past and present, all gathered to honor the couple who'd built something lasting from the most uncertain of beginnings. Father Miguel, ancient now but still sharp, raised a toast. "I married these two in my church 30 years ago." Jane was frightened, Yates was determined, and I wasn't entirely sure they weren't both crazy. Laughter rippled through the crowd. But they proved me wrong. They showed us all that love built on respect, trust, and genuine partnership is the strongest foundation there is. To Yates and Jane Zimmerman, may God grant them many more years together. As glasses clinked and well wishes filled the air, Yates looked at Jane, really looked at her. He saw the girl who'd slept in a church pew, the woman who'd been brave enough to run toward an uncertain future. He saw his wife, his partner, the mother of his children and grandmother to his grandchildren. He saw 3 decades of shared mornings and whispered conversations and bodies entwined in darkness. He saw his whole life reflected in her eyes, and it was beautiful. No regrets. He murmured, echoing that conversation from so many years ago. Jane smiled, the expression lighting her face in a way that made him see both who she was now and who she'd been then. Only that I didn't find that church pew sooner. They lived to see the First World War come and go, their grandson serving in France and returning changed but whole. They saw the birth of great-grandchildren, marveling at the way DNA wove familiar features into new faces. They watched automobiles replace horses on Old Tucson's Main Street, though the ranch maintained its working animals out of both necessity and preference. Yates died in his sleep in the spring of 1923, at the age of 66. He simply didn't wake up one morning, leaving Jane reaching across the bed to find cold sheets beside her. The loss was devastating, a wound that felt like it might never fully heal. But she'd had 40 years with him, 40 years of love and laughter and partnership. Not everyone could say they'd been that blessed. Jane lived another 7 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who'd inherited her strength and his steadiness. She remained active in ranch management, offering advice but trusting Thomas to make the final decisions. She taught her granddaughters to bake bread and her grandsons to stand up for what was right. She told stories about their grandfather, keeping his memory vivid and alive. When she died in the winter of 1930, just shy of her 71st birthday, her family gathered around her bed. Caroline held one hand, Thomas the other, while Jacob stood at the foot. Her grandchildren filled the room, and in the hallway she could hear the lighter voices of great-grandchildren asking when they could see Grandma Jane. "Tell them," she whispered to Caroline, "to be brave. Tell them to choose their own paths. Tell them love is worth fighting for." Her eyes closed, and in her mind she was young again, curled in that church pew, exhausted and frightened and alone. But then came the sound of boots on stone, and a man's voice, kind despite its gruffness, asking if she planned to sleep there indefinitely. She'd opened her eyes to see Yates Zimmerman standing in the moonlight, offering his hand and, though neither of them knew it yet, his heart. "Yes," she murmured with her last breath, answering a question no one in the room had asked. But somewhere, in whatever place souls go when bodies fail, she knew Yates heard her. She'd said yes to his proposal 46 years ago, and she was saying yes again now. Yes to joining him. Yes to whatever came next. Yes to continuing the great adventure they'd started together. They buried her beside Yates in the small cemetery outside Old Tucson, near the church where their story had begun. Father Miguel's successor presided over the service, speaking of faith and love and lives well lived. The whole town turned out, testament to the respect Jane had earned over her decades in Arizona. On her gravestone, beneath her name and dates, Thomas had arranged for a simple inscription. She found her home and gave one to all who knew her. The Zimmerman Ranch continued through the generations that followed, adapting to changing times but maintaining the values Yates and Jane had established. Their great-great-grandchildren still work the land, still gather for holidays in the house that's been expanded and modernized but remains, at its core, the home Yates built and Jane transformed from a house into something more. And sometimes, on cool desert evenings when the sun sets in shades of amber and rust, when the first stars begin to emerge in that endless Arizona sky, ranch hands swear they can hear voices on the wind. Low laughter, murmured conversation, the sound of two people who found each other against all odds and built something that would outlast them both. The story of the cowboy who found a woman sleeping in a church pew and gave her not just a real bed, but a real life became part of Old Tucson's folklore, passed down through generations as a reminder that sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected places. That courage and kindness can change everything. That love, when it's real, has the power to transform not just two lives but all the lives that follow. In the end, that's what they left behind. Not just a successful ranch or accomplished children or the material markers of a life well lived. They left behind a story about choosing hope over fear, about the courage it takes to accept help and the grace required to offer it, about finding home in another person's eyes and building a future from nothing but determination and love. The church still stands in Old Tucson, though it's been renovated several times since 1883. The third pew from the altar on the left side remains, worn smooth by over a century of use. Tourists sometimes sit there, unknowing, while locals pass by with knowing smiles, because they remember. They remember the story of Jane and Yates, of the woman who ran toward an uncertain future and the man who offered her shelter and so much more. And on quiet nights, when the desert holds its breath and the stars blaze overhead like promises, it's easy to believe the story isn't really over. that somewhere in some place beyond our seeing, a cowboy and his bride still sit on a porch, hands clasped, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Still talking, still laughing, still choosing each other, day after day, year after year, for all eternity. Their love story began with 3 nights in a church pew, and a week that changed everything. It continued through 40 years of marriage and 80 years of legacy. And it endures still, in the hearts of descendants who carry their DNA and their values, in the stories told around dinner tables and campfires, in the very land they worked and the home they built, because some loves are too powerful to be contained by a single lifetime. Some stories are too important to remain in the past. And some nights, when conditions are just right, the boundaries between then and now, between life and after, grow thin enough that we can almost reach through and touch the truth that real love never truly ends. It just transforms, becoming part of the foundation upon which new loves, new lives, new stories are built, the end.